Today is May 31st, 2012. Welcome to Our Voices. Today we're going to talk about a dark day in history. 100 years ago, a small town in Tulsa, Oklahoma called Black Wall Street was burned to the ground, and hundreds of people have died from it. Again, we're going to talk with the executive director of the Tulsa Historical Society and Museum as she gives us the backstory to what happened 100 years ago on this day. Again, this is Our Voices.
Love goes around Welcome to Our Voices. I have a special guest with me on this sacred day. She is Miss Michelle Place. She is the executive director for the Tulsa Historical Society and Museum. Michelle, how you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you for the honor of sharing our story with your audience today.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Michelle, the purpose of this interview is because, for one, um, this particular story doesn't get told. A lot of people don't know about it. And also, people like LeBron James, um, he was supposed to produce a film that was supposed to mark the 100th anniversary of the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot Massacre. And again, this right here, Our Voices, um, I feel that it was deemed necessary to really talk about this because, again, this is a part of history that doesn't get told. And again, I thank you. And again, it's an honor to talk with you about this. Before I go any further, Michelle, can you tell the viewers a little something about the museum?
About our museum. There was always an idea about a permanent place in which to collect, present, and preserve our history, really as early as the 1920s. But it was in 1963 when we were fully incorporated by a bunch of citizens of our community. And I think that they really wanted to talk about Tulsa as the oil capital of the world, as the Magic City, as one of America's most beautiful cities. And it's taken a while to evolve. It was in 1997 that there was a capital campaign, some property was purchased, and then some renovation and construction of a new museum wing. So we are housed really in the central part of Tulsa. And we have a 27,000 square foot facility. We have 8 rotating galleries that they rotate annually. And our mission is to tell all of Tulsa's stories, not just about Tulsa's oil history. There's so much more to our community. And so a part of that certainly is talking about our history from 1921, from the Tulsa Race Massacre, as we approach this 100th anniversary.
All right. Now, you've answered my first question, the makeup of Tulsa. Well, let's elaborate a little bit. Explain the makeup, as you did, of Tulsa, and explain the makeup of Black Wall Street.
Of Black Wall Street. I think possibly what you're really reaching for is about the Greenwood district and what it was like up until 1921 and what it was like afterwards. Those of us who are connected to this story, who want to tell this story, are committed to, you can't just talk about 2 days of events, that you have to understand how Black Wall Street came into being, which is such an incredible story to begin with. But then we also need to talk about the aftermath, about its heyday after the Tulsa Race Massacre. And then we need to talk about the demise of it. So if you will indulge me, let me begin with a little bit of Oklahoma history. You really have to go back to before even the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, when the central part of what we now call the United States was the home to indigenous peoples, many of them who were nomadic. They were following those buffalo herds as far east as Indiana, Illinois, even into Ohio, and as far west, certainly into the Rocky Mountains, and then the whole north-south borderlands of our nation today. And so with Manifest Destiny in the 1800s, with that Louisiana Purchase, the Western migration, and it really comes down to land ownership. That plays such a role in our area. So a number of treaties are signed with Native Americans, with the federal government. Then you move into the early 1800s, and the focus is on the southeastern United States, with what is commonly known as the 5 civilized tribes. Those were tribes who interacted, did business with, married, had children with the 5 tribes: Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and even the Seminole from Florida. And so it was Andrew Jackson who and his federal government at the time that determined that that land in the southeastern United States was needed for European persons of European descent to dominate, to grow crops, rice, beans, et cetera, et cetera. But they had a problem. They had to move the indigenous people. So this is the early 1800s, and I'm referring to the Trail of Tears. Now, before the Trail of Tears actually happened, there were a number of tribes and clans within those tribes who made the decision to move to the land that had been designated to them. That would be Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. We became a state in 1907. And so some of these folks could see the handwriting on the wall of European domination and decided to go on and make this journey and to build their lives. And it all comes down to owning land and dreaming dreams and the hope of prosperity and peace. Well, then we have the forced removal, the 5 tribes who are then forced to make their way to Indian Territory. And what you need to know about these 5 tribes is that all of them were slavers. They had enslaved people, not only some white folks that they would have defeated in battle, but also those of African descent. They could have been freedmen, they could have been runaway slaves, but then there are also persons of African descent who are not slaves. That journey is made, people come into Indian Territory and begin to build their lives. Along comes the Civil War, and that presents a really difficult problem for these tribes because of being slavers. Many of them then were forced to go with the Confederacy. Some of them saw or felt that the Union troops would ultimately prevail, and so they sided with the Yankees. Just like in stories that we've read, our history books, brother against brother, same thing is happening in the Indian tribes. Next, you move, the next big significant thing that happens is with the Dawes Act. And that says that the land of these individual tribes no longer belongs to the tribes, but to individuals. There were different treaties that were signed with the United States federal government, and so you can't paint with a broad brush here. But what really the federal government was about was annihilating Native American culture, to put an end to their customs, their way of life, their social structure. And so it's at that point that the land is then allotted. Allotments is the term that we use, that is given to the individuals. Now, what happens in some tribes, and this goes back to the Civil War, that with each different treaty, all persons are not treated the same. And to make a longer story shorter, some of those who had been slaves end up in a sort of no man's land. They're not really belonging to the tribes, and they're not full United States citizens. Then when you move to the Dawes Act, that plays a role in the allotment. And so this land acreage is given to people, and that's a number of different ways. But for example, in some tribes, If you were a head of household, male, over 18 years old, you might get 160 acres. If you were over 18 years old, not married, you might get 80 acres. If you were under 18 years old, you might only get 40 acres. Another problem with this allotment system is sometimes those family allotments were not adjoined, okay? Also coming with that is taxes. So if your child's allotment is miles and miles away, you've maybe even never seen it and you owe taxes on it, then, and if you've been used to always dealing on the barter system and trading, you might not be so keen to hold on to the land. What I'm leading up to is you very easily could have been cheated out of the land. Now, at the same time, from the 1880s up until about the 1920s, Oklahoma is seen as a land of promise, particularly for oppressed people. Whether African Americans had come to Oklahoma via the Trail of Tears as enslaved persons, or if they had continued to live in the southeastern United States under Jim Crow in a sharecropper system. Oklahoma is advertised as a place that could be of peace and prosperity, which ultimately was the main goal, and to own your land. And so during this time period, the early 1900s through 1920s, there are approximately 50 Black towns or settlements scattered across the state of Oklahoma, okay? Blacks understood that if they would live in community, that they could support one another, and they also could have education. Education being so very, very important to people who just a couple of generations past emancipation. Education was the ticket out of poverty. And so some of the folks who came here were professionals. They had been educated at historically Black colleges and universities. They were attorneys, pharmacists, dentists, et cetera, et cetera. And so they're also coming here. Again, it's this idea of pooling our resources. And so some of these settlements were not large enough to sustain themselves. And so they begin to migrate to larger communities. This is the story of Greenwood, of African Americans coming into ownership of land through multiple different ways, but living in community. When Oklahoma came to statehood in 1907, the very first legislative act that was passed was Jim Crow, which affirmed segregation. So what that means in terms of Greenwood and the building of Greenwood is that the residents there, they're only selling property to persons of color, okay? So this becomes a very segregated area. The residents of Greenwood could not take their dollars and spend them outside of the Greenwood district for goods and services. That means that the residents are spending money at the grocery store, who then goes to the pharmacist, who then goes to the clothing shop or the beauty parlor. So it said that every dollar would change hand 19 times before it left the Greenwood community. Now, another way that money is coming into what is now known as Black Wall Street, and it's becoming more prosperous, is that there were a number of Greenwood residents who were domestics. They worked in the homes in South Tulsa for the rich oil families. They could have been cooks or housekeepers or nannies. They would receive their pay generally on a Thursday evening and then return to Greenwood, where they would bring their money back to the community. And so then it begins to transfer hands. So that's how Greenwood becomes very prosperous and very wealthy. In the late 1900, in the late teens of the 1900s, many residents of Greenwood had multi-story homes. They had beautiful home furnishings with baby grand pianos. They wore beautiful clothes. They had china and crystal and silver, and they had the automobile. So what begins to happen in Greenwood is you are surrounded by white supremacy, basically. And so if those who are maybe working class whites haven't reached a level of success, are looking at Greenwood and seeing all of these material signs of prosperity. And so there's an act of jealousy there. We can talk more in just a minute about the actual event, the complete destruction, annihilation of Greenwood. But then there is the story of the rebirth and the rebuilding, and actually Greenwood's success. Its best days were in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And then there is a story about how Greenwood ultimately comes to its demise. So that's a lot of information. What didn't I make clear? What question do you have?
That's all right. That's all right. You start to paint the picture of Tulsa.
Right.
How long has Black Wall Street been in existence?
Well, it started, we have records of settlements in as early as 1903, but certainly by 1906, by statehood, is when we have reports of entrepreneurs, O.W. Gurley, J.B. Stratford, and others who are have money and are capable of purchasing land, as I described, from the Native Americans one way or another. And then they begin to divide what they have purchased and sell it only to persons of colors. So it's the very early 1900s.
What was the population of the African American community roughly at that time?
At the time, in the 1920s, we have record of about 10,000 residents in the Greenwood district. Tulsa at the time had about 100,000 people.
Okay. Did Black Wall Street have a mission or goal?
I would say that the mission or goal was always to live in prosperity and peace, to dream dreams and to live in community with one another and be supportive and love one another and build the very best of education system, the most prosperous of businesses. But again, I think the basics are land ownership and prosperity, peace and prosperity, not necessarily all in that order.
Okay. Michelle, how did the race riot first start?
Okay. I will give you more or less the stick that broke the camel's back, if you will, the incident which really set it off. And then because everyone wants to know that part of it, although it's very complicated, and we'll circle back to that. There was a young, a teenage man, his name was Dick Rowland. He was a shoe shine or boot black on Main Street in Tulsa, literally south of the tracks and in Tulsa's main business district. He was said to do very well, shining all of those shoes. A young white female elevator operator, her name was Sarah Page. She had come to Tulsa to go to business college, and she was operating that elevator cage. If you've ever been in one of those, you know that they don't always line up with the floor levels, and it's manually operated. We don't know exactly what happened, whether that elevator was off and Dick Rowland, who had entered the Drexel building to go in this elevator to go across to an approved restroom that he had permission to use, because it was the days of Jim Crow and he couldn't just go to any restroom. And so he entered and something happened, whether he fell into her, stepped on her foot, grabbed her arm. Stories began to be exaggerated up to and including that he personally attacked her. Whatever did happen, she screamed, and there was a store clerk who comes to the rescue. And Dick Rowland did what any normal Black man of the time would have done. He ran, and he ran back to Greenwood. It's merely blocks away. And so it was on the afternoon of May 30th that he is arrested. What you need to understand is what was going on around the country, not just in Tulsa, that race relations were very tense, that it was the rise of the Klan, it was the idea of white supremacy. And so there were residents of Greenwood, many of them were World War I veterans who had fought in Europe, been seen as heroes. They had returned to the United States, to their homes, to Jim Crow and all of these lynchings that were going on. So they were very afraid that Dick Rowland, one of their own, was going to be lynched. And so they come to the courthouse, which is located in our business district in the South Tulsa, the white part of town, and demand his release. The sheriff tells them that, don't worry about it, I have him under control, everything's fine. Basically patted him on the head and told him to go back home. But as the day progressed, this is May 31, the rumors, the gossip flows throughout the countryside. And so people begin to gather. Whites, an unknown number. And I've heard the numbers from 1,000 to 10,000. And, you know, we just don't know how many were there. But there seems to be ultimately a confrontation on the courthouse steps. Greenwood, these World War I veterans had returned to the courthouse with more men with them. Words are exchanged, there is a confrontation, ultimately a gun goes off and all hell breaks loose. And so at that point, the Greenwood residents quickly returned to Greenwood to set up perimeters to protect their homes and their businesses. And the whites were clearly right behind them. It didn't take long to realize that the Greenwood residents were outmanned, outgunned, and as the next few hours go by, the whites began to loot the homes and businesses, to commit acts of murder in people's homes. Also, people were shot in the streets, and homes are beginning to burn. There are reports of airplanes which are flying over and dropping incendiary bombs of some kind. We don't know exactly what. I've heard everything from turpentine balls to sticks of dynamite. But nevertheless, by early the next morning, 36 blocks of Greenwood are completely decimated and 10,000 people are homeless.
You have described the damage in Tulsa. I mean, there's a lot of damage there. About how many lives were lost?
That is another thing of which we cannot come to an accurate account. I will tell you that originally there were 36 death certificates that were issued at the time. And then within a few years, the number rose to 100. Today, the common number that we talk about is about 300. But again, we don't know that, and there are a number of reasons. There are reports of bodies. So you can imagine, this shootout on the streets. There are also men who are tied behind vehicles and dragged through the streets. There are reports of bodies being thrown onto trucks, just one on top of another, haphazard. Reports of bodies dumped into the Arkansas River, into mine shafts, and then also into mass graves. We don't know how many people fled. There were a number that had automobiles, and so many, I think that's what I would have done, was to put my family in the automobile and drive maybe to extended families in Muskogee, south of here, maybe to Wichita, Kansas, as far as way to Kansas City. We also have reports of Greenwood residents who were hiding in the hills that surround our community. So we don't know how many ultimately returned. We don't know how many fled never to come back, and then how many were actually killed and their bodies disposed of in such horrible ways.
Did any part of Black Wall Street ever get rebuilt?
That's a great question, and it's one that we really like to share that part of the story. Immediately, in fact, even the next day, the residents of Greenwood, those who were determined to not be thrown off of their land, began to rebuild. Now, the Red Cross had showed up on the scene pretty quickly, and they began to provide food and clothing and shelter. There were tents, sort of army tents, if you will, that were given to the residences to put on their property. And they were urged to create just any kind of shack that they could, so that they would be identified as that being their property. One of the things that the Tulsa City Council did was to issue some building codes. And one of them said you can only rebuild with non-flammable materials. That meant brick or masonry, possibly cinder block. So even though there was a brick plant within sight of the Greenwood district, because of Jim Crow, they refused to sell to any person of color. So the residents of Greenwood had to travel outside of the district to as far away as Arkansas, into Kansas, and beyond, to bring building materials back to rebuild their homes. So you can imagine that this took some time for that to happen. And there were many who were forced to live in those tents throughout the cold winter months of December, January, and February. But the really great thing is that by 1925, Greenwood was completely rebuilt, even better than what it had been in 1921. And another great thing that really happened was in 1926, the National Negro Business League decided to have their their convention in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So what that says to me is the nation was watching Greenwood and watching its success. So really the heyday of Greenwood was into the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And music becomes such an important part. The Tulsa sound, jazz really takes hold. We're halfway between Kansas City and New Orleans. And so many, many musicians, if you look into music history and jazz history, the blues at the time, lots of those roads lead back to Tulsa.
Okay. I have to check it out.
Yeah.
Michelle, did state or federal government pitch in any money to help rebuild, recover any losses?
I could say no, and I could stop right there. No, they never did. No one was ever held accountable. There were no charges that were ever filed against anyone. That's another reason that we don't know what the numbers are of who participated in these vile crimes against humanity. No one was ever held accountable, nor have any kind of reparations or restitution ever been given.
How many survivors are there alive today?
We only have 3 living survivors now, and they're all past 100 years old. So one is 106, another is 103, maybe 104. So that would have meant at the time of the race massacre that they were young children, 3 and 6 years old. There certainly are many descendants who still live in the community and are very active. I know a great number of them. But as far as living survivors, we only have the 3.
Does the city of Tulsa acknowledge any event, like annual events concerning the 1921 riot massacre?
I would say that the city as a whole does not. Now, we for years have had the Juneteenth celebrations, certainly, that have transpired in Greenwood. There certainly are a number of festivals that take place periodically. But this year is different because it is the 100th anniversary. There are many, many things that are going on. The best place to get an overall picture is to visit the website tulsa2021.org. And that is more or less a clearinghouse of centennial events. Now, we do have the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commemorative Commission. I know that's a real mouthful, but that's not really a government agency. It is just a number of people who came together beginning in 2015 who wanted to make sure that this story was told. We came together not so that we would put together big events sponsored by the commission. It's up to the individual institutions, whether they're churches or people who want to have a parade or other events like John Legend and Stacey Abrams are going to be here early next week. Those tickets sold out within 30 minutes. Even I, as a commissioner, I don't have a ticket to see John Legend. That makes me really sad. But
now, Michelle, you mean you don't have that VIP access?
I don't. Yeah, but I think that also sheds light on the fact that it is individual groups who are putting together different events, and we are very careful not to use the word celebration. This is not a celebration, a commemoration, that it is a time that we honor, pay homage to, that we memorialize in a way that has never happened before. I really had to get tough with a particular reporter who kept wanting to use the word celebration, and it really was grating on me. I took great umbrage, and it took a lot of my talking to convince him, do not use this word celebration. Do not use this word celebration. it's just really important to those of us here in Tulsa. That may not be what you've asked for, but there's a
All
little
right.
side bit there. But I hope that helps your listeners to understand the magnitude of what this city is feeling right now. This is our grieving. This is our mourning. The day will come when we celebrate, but we're not there yet.
Okay. Michelle, how many Black-owned businesses are there in Tulsa now?
Oh, I wish you wouldn't have asked me that question because I'm just terrible at numbers. I remember facts and names and all. Let me just describe what Greenwood looks like today. How will that be? Originally, Greenwood was 36 blocks, square blocks, and Greenwood Avenue really ran from south to north. It angled a little bit, and it's a very rectangular space that we're talking about, not square. It's not as wide as it is tall. And so Greenwood ran that length of it. So these businesses were thriving. I can only imagine what a homecoming parade would have been like for Booker T. Washington, which would have been the center of the community, that great high school. And so the Greenwood begins to meet its demise really with integration. And in the 1960s, a couple of things happened. Number one, all of those entrepreneurs who had first come and settled Greenwood and then rebuilt it begin to come to retirement. And it was probable that many of their children whom they had raised had gone off to college, had become professionals, or didn't want to take over that grocery store or that beauty parlor or the hat shop. It's also that many of those future generations left Tulsa to settle in Kansas City or Boston or to parts unknown. The next big thing that really happens is integration. And so my contemporaries, I'll tell you that I'm 63 years old, and my contemporaries talk about getting on a bus in Greenwood and riding it to the suburbs to go to the big mall, and they could not only spend their money for goods and services out there, they also could work they could get jobs outside of the Greenwood district. Another thing that's happening is with integration, then Greenwood residents no longer have to only live in Greenwood. They can live in other parts of the city. So that begins this demise, much like we're seeing in small town America at the time. The next thing that happens is urban renewal, or as many call it, urban removal. As my good friend, the author Michael Wallace says, with progress, you have to give something up. And so today, right through the heart of deep Greenwood is Interstate 244 that was built by urban renewal, as it happened in so many other communities across our country. I don't know of any of us that want to give up the interstate right now. And the fact of the matter is, we've got an interstate and we had eminent domain that happened right through the heart of Greenwood. So while there is great desire to invest money in the Greenwood district to help particularly Black entrepreneurs begin their businesses, there is some land that is empty right now. So it's a big discussion of what happens with it. But not only do we have the interstate, we have Oklahoma State University, the Tulsa campus, overlooks the Greenwood district. I would say that, and I would encourage your listeners, please come to Tulsa. We've just been put on the Civil Rights Trail. So from Montgomery to Memphis to Little Rock and now on to Tulsa, that while there is not much to see in terms of the original buildings that were there. For me, when I wander the district, it's let your imaginations go to hear the voices and the thriving community from, people laughing and being joyous on the streets and in community. What would those sounds be with automobiles and children and a homecoming parade down the street? So I think it's certainly a place to walk and to remember. Now, also, we are about to open a interactive museum. It's called Greenwood Rising, which will tell the story of the African experience beginning in 1619 on up through Greenwood, 1921, and then beyond. Then the next gallery that you go into, it's all very high tech. It would be you sit in like a barber chair and there's a hologram that then tells you the story of Greenwood, and it's interactive. I can hardly wait for that. And then the next gallery that you go to, you are immersed in May 31 and June 1 with all of the sounds and sights that's going on. I'm imagining it like the first episode of The Watchmen, that's what it would be like being immersed in that. And then the next space is a contemplation, a place for conversation, and a place for commitment. You sit down next to someone from Milwaukee or Denmark or Seattle, and you have a conversation. And then there is a commitment wall where you hopefully will write and commit to, I as an individual will, and fill in the blank. So there's lots going on in the district. We are seeing the rise of small businesses again, which is all very exciting. There is investment in infrastructure. It's never as fast, it's never as much as we all would like, but we've started down that road.
I have two more questions. How is the city of Tulsa on race relations now?
I would say we're just like any other city across the country. We are still a very segregated community. It is still that railroad track that divides North Tulsa from South Tulsa, North Tulsa being predominantly African American. South Tulsa is predominantly white. There certainly are pockets of persons of color in South Tulsa. The farther east that you go, we have a large Hispanic population, also Asian, lots of refugees from Myanmar in our community. We certainly have a lot of Vietnamese. With Tulsa, I really don't think that we're unusual, but there certainly is a segment of the population who doesn't understand why we have to keep talking about this, that this was a bad part of our history. Why can't we talk about the good things? Why can't we talk about Tulsa as the oil capital of the world and all of the culture and the class that we have here, our world-class ballet and our symphony and art museums and all of those things? Why do you have to talk about history? So I think we have to keep talking. One of the statements that I often use is that the past causes the present and affects the future. And what we need our community and beyond to understand is that we still have the hurts and the pains from 1921. We still have that trauma individually, collectively, and we need to listen to those who haven't had a voice, who haven't been able to tell their side of the story, and how being a citizen of Greenwood affected them and their family. And also we need to recognize the loss of generational wealth and what that means when you don't have that land to pass down, to get a second mortgage so that you can send your children to college or to improve your home. We have to talk about things like disparities in education and healthcare. We have to talk about what justice and equality really looks like. I think that some of those who don't want to talk about it also come from that greatest generation who didn't want to talk about anything bad. They didn't want to talk about the skeletons in their closet or a divorce in the family or an unwed mother, that some of it is that same kind of mentality. I would say that much of history is really bad stuff. It's about somebody pounding on somebody else and taking their stuff.
Michelle, today I read in the news that Tennessee Governor Bill Lee passed a bill basically not to talk about history because it's if you bring it up, it makes society divisive.
And feel bad.
Right.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
A few weeks ago, I interviewed a history teacher here in West Virginia, and she said that she's going to talk about it. Talk about the history because, again, it needs to be told. It needs to have a voice. And, I look at it like this. If someone is telling me that we don't need to talk about it, then we have to put away 9/11. We have to put away Desert Storm. I mean, this is something within the past 30 years to American history. So the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, we got to leave that alone. So we cannot pick and choose what we can talk about and what we can't when it comes to history. Because again, this isn't right. I mean, again, it needs to be told.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, our governor recently signed the same bill, and I guess it's just in my ignorance. I was just dumbfounded that was before us, because that is so not my way of thinking. I can cut to the end of the story that says those of us who are committed to the telling of particularly 1921 are going to keep talking about 1921. The ones that I feel badly for are public school teachers who are put in a very, very difficult situation. But I hearken back to how we've taught history. And I've already told you my age, that I'm 63, that I grew up certainly celebrating President's Day and George Washington, who I was taught that he could throw a shiny silver dollar across the Potomac. Well, and he chopped down a cherry tree and never told a lie. Well, for those people who have seen the Potomac, it's a pretty aha moment thinking about anyone being able to throw a shiny silver dollar across that river. I was also taught about these men of honor, our founding fathers. And then when I began to read more and learn more and understand that those founding fathers who we had on pedestals never intended for a person such as myself, a female, to ever be able to cast a vote, nor a person of color, some of that awe of our founding fathers began to fade for me. And then if you study history, and again, I don't care what time period you're looking at, whether it's the English who are trying to annihilate the Scottish culture. Let's be honest about the Civil War and what that's about. Let's be honest about our first constitutional convention, where those from New England who were very supportive of public education had conflict with those from the South who only wanted the big planters, the plantation owners, to be educated. And so today that's still affecting us in terms of who is committed to education. What are your most educated regions of the country? Um, you know, if you want to talk about Genghis Khan or anybody, again, I say history is about people pounding on somebody else and taking their stuff. And we need to be honest about it, and we need to understand why that happened and what was at stake. And instead of the history being written by the victors, as is the traditional way, that it is incumbent upon each and every one of us to make this space for the stories of those who were the victims or the oppressed to be told. And I think that they're beginning to find their voice, but and I sit in a chair of white privilege. I understand that. But it is my responsibility to provide this space for someone like Ray Whiting to be able to ask these questions and to have these conversations, honest conversations. I, as a white person, need to go to plays that are written by minorities and listen to that music and read the poetry and attend events. So, boy, you've really gotten me on a soapbox there. Can you tell that I'm very distraught over this CRT? I'm just dumbfounded by it.
So before I let you go, I normally give people 1 minute to give a final word. I think you gave me a final word, but hey, I'll give you another minute if you want it. You're for it. Again, you're speaking truth. And again, this is something that, again, as far as with privilege and everything, a lot of people don't know it. As far as generations, they don't know. I've had numerous debates and arguments with folks, and they don't understand. They just don't. And I tell them, I say, okay, let's just turn the tables, but they don't want to.
Yeah, yeah.
This is what took place back then. Oh, that was back then. I have nothing to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
But the systemic part of racism is what's going on, you see. And now that we look at situations with the police and unarmed Black men,
and
big problems there. So again, this is something, again, we have to address as a nation.
Mm-hmm.
And, we're not going to get anywhere if no one is really open to dialogue and really just sit at the table and say, okay, here's my hand, here's your hand.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it.
One of my favorite tricks, if you will, is that when I'm in a conversation and confronted with denial or whatever, or someone who is espousing lots of hasty generalizations, every, none, never, not my problem, I didn't do it. So I ask this question. I ask, so what do your Black friends say? And I shut up. What do your LGBTQ friends say? And so we get a little bit of something, or they have to admit, well, I don't have any Black friends. I don't know anyone who's transgender or whatever. And then the response is, well, you know what? I recommend you get some. And you have those conversations. And I think it's one conversation at a time. We're not going to sway a whole football field. Kaepernick has proved that to us. And that's not going to work. It's going to be these conversations one-on-one, one person at a time, one tiny little inch at a time. You probably won't convert them, but hopefully by asking whatever question that best fits you. For me, it's, well, what do your Black friends say? that will poke their nest and make them uncomfortable. The other thing that I feel very encouraged, here's why I'm encouraged, is because there is so much pushback right now, which means that those who are not on the same page that you and I are, that they're hearing things and they're becoming uncomfortable. It's niggling at them. And so we're not going to fix it overnight. We're in it for the long game. We're not able to check the racism box and move on. It will take generations of work, but I have to be optimistic. What I also know is that if we can keep talking about history and lifting up those examples, not only of the things that we didn't do well, but the things that we did really well. What are those human condition? What were the people of Greenwood about? They were about love for one another. They were about commitment to their community. They had hard work. They had tenacity. Those are the things that we need to hang on to and to recognize, embrace, and it's history that will help us meet our future. Whether it's bad history or good history, it's the lessons we've learned, the things we want to embrace or we want to get rid of, that then help us meet tomorrow.
Michelle Place, thank you very much for coming on to Our Voices.
Thank you.
It's
My
a pleasure
pleasure.
and an honor. And you take care, okay?
Thank you. I hope our paths cross again.
I hope so too. Thank you.
All right.